Well, welcome back, everybody. And today we're on the last chapter. We're going to be dealing with unions today and tomorrow. And then we're going to close out all of this as we finish up this course and this textbook. So today we're going to take a look at some of the fundamentals of unions, define what a union is and the collective bargaining agreements. And then we will move on tomorrow with some of the processes of organizing a union. So let's begin today with the fundamentals of definitions and concepts that deal with unions. Well, welcome back, everybody, and today we are finishing up this course and this book as we look at Chapter 16, Union Management Relations. Now, what are unions? Well, unions, by definition, are formal associations of workers that promote the interest of its members through collective action. Now, what does that mean? Well, people in a workplace, employees. Now, this is labor, it's not management, but employees, if they want to, they can come together, which is a collective, and they can choose to have employee representation, which is the union. And this union has certain power that they have over the employer in the employee-employer relationship. Now, employees join unions because of several different things. First of all, they're dissatisfied with how they are treated by employers. And in the past, that was a common problem. And I mean past when I say around the Industrial Revolution and up until, I would say, after World War II, maybe even into the 60s. You've had unfair treatment of employees by the employers, and that unfair treatment has made them desire to form unions to have better protection and representation. And because of that, they believe that the union can improve their work situation. And that's debatable. And many people join it thinking that, but oftentimes that's not the case. Now, I'll say at the very beginning, I'm no fan of unions. I have, after looking at both sides, I've come to realize that unions used to be a necessary function or a necessary entity in an organization. As I said before, labor practices around the turn of the 20th century was horrendous. It was worse than slave labor. People were killed because of bad work conditions. Families were having to go to work because companies would pay the man almost nothing and require him to work from sun up to sundown. So women and children oftentimes were forced to go to work right alongside the husband just to be able to survive. So conditions were horrible. Unions helped to clean up all of that. And another thing that the unions have done is be able to provide you with benefits. And all the benefits that organizations offer today used to not be in place. But unions are responsible for benefits, and I'll explain how that came about a little bit later on. But some of the factors leading to employee unionization, again, poor work conditions. And again, this was something that was way out of control back when we became industrialized, and over time it's been improving, but there are still times when companies are exploiting, when they take advantage of the employees. So work conditions, compensation, not getting enough pay, and that's a big issue today for most organizations who do unionize, is trying to get more money for their labor. Management style, and this is the type of problem where the management is more of a dictator and authoritarian. They can be abusive, so that could be an issue that would lead to unionization. Also, employee treatment. If they perceive that they're being treated unfairly, they're going to try to rectify that and use unions as a means of doing that. Now, why do employers resist unions? Well, unions affect how employees in workplaces are managed. A boss, in most respects, should be a boss. He or she dictates how that operation should be run. But when a union comes in they dictate oftentimes or demand things upon the employer that may or may not coincide with what the employer wants to have done. So it prevents the employer from being able to exercise total control over his or her company. Unions create inefficiencies in the workplace that cause waste and poor performance. And an example of that is a worker may not be allowed to help another worker because their job description says this and this is all they can do. And that prevents a lot of times from teamwork and group work. When they can pool their resources and come together, they can waste time in that type of arrangement. It's just the way that the worker is held to that bargaining agreement. There's very little cohesion and loyalty now to the company. Whereas, let me give you an example maybe. I finished my work and Joe next to me is working, and I can go over there and I can help Joe and we can get the work done quicker and move on to other work. But because the union says that I can only do my job and my job only, I may have to just let Joe stumble, and he may hold me up and I may hold another person up as a result of that, just because the union says I can't do that. So an example, a real-time example, was when the union that represents the workers at Federal Express, the aircraft mechanics, they went on. Well, they didn't go on strike, but they had offended the union. And prior to the union getting involved, those aircraft mechanics had ways of taking shortcuts that would get more planes out at a faster pace as far as repair work goes. Well, when the union got involved, it prevented those workers from being able to take those shortcuts, so they had to do it the union way, and it caused a dramatic decrease in productivity in getting those planes out. So this is another reason why employers resist unions. Unions result in higher wages and benefits. Now, that's a good thing for the employee, but it's not a good thing for the employer, and in the long run, it's not very good for the employee either. And you may ask, well, how is that? Well, when you take a look at the emergency situation, crisis situation that the auto workers had in Detroit, Detroit right now is almost a ghost town because of the influence of unions in that town. They were demanding that the automobile manufacturers pay these workers an inordinate amount of money. And because of that, one of the biggest reasons is that they went under is because they couldn't afford to pay the workers. I mean, production went down, demand went down, but the unions were still demanding these very high wages, and it got them in trouble. So steel mills are in Europe now, Pittsburgh, or Pennsylvania as a whole, used to be a big steel producing region. But the steel mills have gone to Europe because of unions. Unions have turned some Pennsylvania towns into ghost towns that once thrived because of just the way that they are demanding so much out of the employer. So those are some of the reasons why employers resist unions. How do you prevent a union from organizing? And what I mean by that is, how do you keep unions from developing in your organization? And organizing is just the creation of a union, when everybody comes together and decide that they want a union. Well, you can develop good employment practices, earn employee trust, encourage employee feedback, offer better compensation and more fair competitive compensation, build supportive supervisory relationships, and both HR professionals and operating managers have to be attentive and responsive to employees. Now, those are all good, and I wouldn't argue with any of them, but I can tell you that that doesn't always work. And I'll give you a good example. Colonial Bread was a company that thrived in Memphis. And I can remember as a child going there on Saturday, and we would get there as they were bringing the bread out. Many people did this. And that bread was hot. It was fresh. You couldn't get it any fresher than when it just came out of the oven. And you could sit there and you could eat slices of bread just hot out of the oven, butter and jelly and all of that stuff. It was a nice place. And it was a great place to work. The people were paid good wages. The conditions were good. People had a good relationship with management, but there were just a few who were not satisfied with what they did have. And they said, let's just join a union, or let's form a union so that we can get more out of the employee or employer. Well, Colonial Bread found out about it, and they said, if you try to organize, then we will close this factory and we will move away. And the employees didn't believe it. Well, one day they showed up for work and there was a padlock on the gate, and Colonial Bread is no longer here. That's what I mean by hurting the productivity and demanding things from an employer that the employer should be making the decisions on. So what happened was they thought they were going to be able to get more, even though they had a good thing. They weren't satisfied. There was good employment relationships. There was good compensation. What you see here on the slide, they were receiving, but they were just not happy. And you're going to have those who are never happy with no matter what you give them. But when they decided to organize, that's when the company shut down. Now they were all, or then they were all out of work. So who did the greater good? Did the union do the greater good, trying to fight for better than what they had been getting? Or was it better just to see them on unemployment? So that's what happens a lot of times with organizations and unions. They're no friends. They try to, at least in some cases, try to make the appearance that they can partner, but there is an adversarial relationship that exists between, and has been and always will be, that adversarial relationship between management and labor. And as you can see here in Figure 16.2, the percentage of workers belonging to unions has gone down, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit as well. Now here you see another visual depiction of the influence of unions, and in the red you see government work, and then in the bottom you see private sector, which are private companies like FedEx or International Paper. Now the red, the government workers, most of the union representation will be within the government. They encourage it, they want it. However, in private industry, you see that the influence has gone down tremendously. And here are the reasons, some of the reasons, that unions don't have the impact that they used to have. Deregulation. Much of the reason why U.S. industries have gone overseas is because of government regulations and restrictions. You've got unions who are after the employer for higher wages and better working conditions. Then you have the government who is placing burdens on industries now with all types of regulations and rules and so forth. And the companies have just said, it's cheaper for us to go overseas. Let's pack up and go. Again, the steel mills of Pennsylvania and many other organizations, Caterpillar, which is a big industrial machinery industry. They've gone to Central America. So many companies today that were big into manufacturing have moved because of the regulations that government and unions have placed on them. But with deregulation, the government has lifted some of those restrictions, and it's easier now for companies to operate in the U.S. So deregulation now has become a big reason why unions are no longer in effect. Foreign competition. We just can't afford to compete. on a global scale with the demands that unions place on employees. These exorbitant salaries, they just can't compete with it in a foreign market. Lack of individual support, increased right to work legislation, increased use of temporary or contingent workers, improved workplace practices, and the belief that unions are no longer seen as necessary. These are all reasons why unions don't have the influence that they used to have. Now, some more geographic changes and industrial changes. As companies move out and go overseas, you don't see the need for unions anymore. Industry changes. We've gone from a industrial manufacturing society into the information age, and there's very little that unions can do to influence that. And workforce changes. People have become more educated now. They have KSAOs that they can market, where in the past unskilled labor was the word of the day, and companies could hire these unskilled workers, put them under all kinds of conditions, and treat them any way they wanted to. And as you see here in Figure 16.4, you see that mainly the government is the entity now that has a big union representation, whereas all of the other industries, and you can take a look at that, have seen a sharp decline. Now let's take a look at some of the laws that have evolved when it comes to unions. First, you have the Railway Labor Act, and this was a shift in government regulation of unions. And just to be honest with you, depending on what political party is in place in the White House will depend on whether or not there is support for unions or no support for unions. When you have Republicans in the White House, normally you'll see less support for unions. Democrats are more supportive of unions. So some of the early legislation, and most of this has come from the support of unions and organized labor. The Railway Labor Act curtailed a lot of the strikes that used to take place in transportation, namely the railroad. And then later on, we see that this came into effect and started affecting airline industries. The Norris-LaGuardia Act in 1932, it guaranteed workers some rights to organize, and it restricted the issuance of court injunctions in labor disputes. So the Norris-LaGuardia Act came as really a response to the Great Depression. The Great Depression put millions of people out of work. Conditions were very tight. Jobs were very few. Workers could pretty much name their price and conditions of labor, and people just had to suck it up and put up with all types of abuse and so forth. Well, no one wanted to complain or say anything because they were afraid they would lose their jobs. And sometimes, if the company wanted to, if there was a labor dispute, they could have the courts force workers to come back to work and resolve the disputes. So the Norris-LaGuardia Act kind of put an end to all of that stuff, and it guaranteed the workers some select rights in their ability to organize. Also, another thing that came out of the Norris-LaGuardia Act was the issuance of the yellow dog contracts. They put an end to it, or discouraged it greatly. Yellow dog contracts were agreements that an employee would enter into as a condition of employment that once they were hired, they would not join a union. So that was an unfair labor practice that the Norris-LaGuardia Act recognized, and they developed laws against that. Now, there are other laws that came about. The Wagner Act, which declared that the government was to encourage collective bargaining. And then they also looked at unfair labor practices. And these are a few of them, and the next slide will show some too. Really what this means is that anything that an employer does to coerce, restrain, or interfere with the collective bargaining process or the right for an employee to join a union would be illegal. You can't, according to this act, base your hiring decision, conditions of employment, and all of that based on a person being in a union and refusing to bargain collectively with representatives of the employees, which means that when it comes time to sit down with the union, you have to do so. You can't refuse the collective bargaining process. Now, the NLRB, that's the National Labor Relations Board, they pretty much look into complaints. They investigate complaints by the employers or the unions. And based on what they find, they can either let it go at that and say there is no case, or they can prosecute violations in courts. So the National Labor Relations Board is kind of the authority over both the employee and employer relationship. Now, in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act came about, and it deals with national emergency strikes. There are some companies that are vital, that if they go on strike, it'll affect the whole industry or could affect even more than that. So this kind of leaned towards the employer instead of the employee this time. And what the national emergency strike caveat would be in the Taft-Hartley Act was that any company that was deemed that critical, before they can go on strike, they have to have an 80-day cooling off period, which means you can't just walk out. We had, for instance, back in the 80s, President Ronald Reagan ordered air traffic controllers back to work. And that was kind of like a national emergency. There were strikes. I don't think they walked out immediately, but President Reagan had some of the military air traffic controllers come and work in civilian airports. But that would have been a national emergency. That would have been a good example of a company, an industry that would fall under this Taft-Hartley Act. The right to work provision means that a person can go to work without having to join a union. And here are some of the laws under that provision. You have right to work laws, and that prohibits requiring employees to join unions. Some companies, especially up north, before you could work there, you had to join a union. Well, that's a right to work law, or a place where a right to work isn't recognized. But if it is a right to work law, you don't have to join a union. Open shop, again, it's a right to work. Employers don't require you to join a union or pay union dues, and that's a big thing with many unions. That really is a deterrent or frustrates union efforts. If I want to go work for, let's say, International Paper, and they're unionized and it's a open shop, then I can come in there, enjoy the same benefits because I work for the same organization with the same employees. I could enjoy the same union benefits that these employees have, and I don't have to pay union dues for it. So I'm getting the benefits without the expense. But now closed shops do require you to join a union before you can be hired. So those are important distinctions when it comes to the ability for a person to come to work as far as going into unions or refusing union membership. Now figure 16.6 just gives you a visual of the states that are right to work states. Neither Tennessee or Mississippi or the South, they have a right to work law or caveat. I'll get it out in just a second. So this is just gives you a depiction The light color is with right-to-work laws. Without right-to-work laws are the darker ones, and you can see most of this is concentrated up north. But you can work in the South pretty much anywhere, and in the Midwest without having to worry about joining unions. Now, a union shop requires that workers must join the union around 30 to 60 days after being hired. An agency shop, as workers don't join the union, but they have to pay union dues to the organization and not the union, so that the unions can't say, well, they're getting the same benefits without paying anything. They pay dues, but they don't pay it to the union. And then maintenance of membership, the workers have to remain members of the union for the period of the labor contract. Now, the Landrum-Griffin Act, it just again protects the democratic rights of union members, but this time what the Landrum-Griffin Act has done is to protect the union member from corruption brought about by the unions. Back especially in the 60s and 70s, there was union corruption. They were extorting money, stealing money from the union members, their membership dues and so forth. So the Landrum-Griffin Act requires unions now to establish bylaws, make financial reports, and provide union members with a Bill of Rights. So we see now that the people that were put into place to protect the employees were exploiting the employees. So the Landrum-Griffin Act kind of put a hold to all of that. And as I said, corruption around the 70s and the 60s, and this act came about in '59. So you can imagine what it was like before this act, because it was bad even after the act was brought into place. So that will finish us up for today, and we'll finish out everything tomorrow. Until then, you have a good day, and we'll see you then. Today you heard some of the fundamentals of unions and the reasons why they're on the decline. Now, unions still exist, and they're still a formidable presence within businesses today. But understanding them and understanding why people are for and against them can help you be a better leader, especially when it comes to having to deal with unions if your organization is involved in the collective bargaining process. Well, that's all we have for today. I'll see you tomorrow.